Most people in the ancient world of Greece and Rome worshipped the gods and the goddesses. It was a world full of divinities. Everywhere you looked, there were divine forces at work, and there were temples and cults of this god and that god for every aspect of human life. But people who reflected philosophically came up with various different options, and in the ancient world, serious thinking people like Cicero in the 1st century BC or Seneca in the 1st century AD, reflected that there were certain specific options which many people then adopted. There were the Epicureans. They believed that if the gods did exist, they were a long way away, and they weren't concerned about us and about our lives, and that the world that we live in was just making itself. It was going along under its own steam by the random movement of atoms which would occasionally swerve and do something different of their own free will. And in that world, there's nothing to be afraid of, because death is simply the end. We just dissolve into nothingness. For the Stoics, and the word Stoic comes from stoa, the porch, like this one here, where the Stoics used to meet and walk to and fro and discuss their ideas. For the Stoics, divinity and the world were all part of the same thing, so that all those ideas about different gods and goddesses were just specific examples of the fact that divinity and the world were part of topan, the everything. They were pantheists. And for pantheists, the world itself is divine in some way. It has this inner force, this inner spark, this divine life, which just goes on and will eventually, as a sort of internal fire, combust itself and burst into glorious flame, and then the whole world will reconstitute itself like a phoenix, and everything will happen again just the same way as it did the first time round. Now, those two main philosophical options were very serious things hammered out by thinkers over many centuries. But there were also plenty of people like Cicero himself who said, well, they're both possible, but actually we don't have enough evidence to be able to decide between the one and the other. They called themselves the academics. And so you have people who say the gods are a long way away, the world just makes itself. That's the Epicureans. The Stoics, who say that actually divinity and the world are all part of the same thing. And you have the people who say, well, there may be a bit of this and a bit of that, but we're not quite sure, so we'll keep all the old religions going just in case. Now, into that world comes the New Testament with its fresh options about who God is, what the world is, and particularly about a storyline in which something new is happening. Because for the Epicureans and the Stoics and the academics, this world is all that there is, and we're trying to find out what it's about so that we can live appropriately within it. But the problem with all those schemes is they can't give a good account of the problem of evil. They're all aware that there are things that we all find wrong with the world, but there's nothing actually you can do about it. The Epicureans say just retire from the world. If you can afford to, live in private and in comfort, and then that's the best you can do. The Stoics say if you really don't like it, the door is open and you're free to leave. In other words, you commit suicide. But the Christians say, no, the God who made this world is going to put it right, and he started that process in Jesus himself. Therefore, we are to live not in conformity with the way the world seems to be at the moment, but with the new world that God has launched in Jesus. Now, here's the thing. In our day, in the modern Western world, most people are by default Epicureans. They believe that if there are gods, they're a long way away, they're not too bothered about us. They may have made some laws which we're supposed to keep, but really they don't intervene in our daily lives. In St. Paul's day, in the Greco-Roman world of the 1st century, most people were by default Stoics. They hadn't necessarily studied, they hadn't necessarily thought about it or read about it, but they basically assumed that the forces of divinity in the world were all suffused within the world, and that if you wanted to be a genuine human, you simply had to get in touch with the way the world was. So that for us reading 1st century documents like the New Testament, it's important to realize that they weren't starting where most of us start. They were starting in a rather different place. But then the gospel comes in across all these options and says to the Epicureans, yes, God is different from the world, but he's actually not far away and he remains involved with it. And to the Stoics, yes, the world is, in a much later poet's phrase, charged with the grandeur of God. But God and the world are not the same thing, and it isn't just a matter of a wheel of time going round and round. on and on forever. It's a matter of God having fixed a day on which he will put the world right, and that the resurrection of Jesus has launched that. To the academics, Paul would say, as he says in his speech on the Areopagus, yes, okay, we can't actually be sure about things on the basis of what we see in the world every day. There are times of ignorance, but God has now put a halt to that because he has established a day on which he will call the world to account by a man whom he's ordained, and he's given assurance about that by raising him from the dead. And so, whatever the philosophies, ancient or modern, what happens with the gospel is a new, larger way of looking at the world, of looking at the true God and his interaction with the world, and of looking at the historical movement which is going towards the day when God will finally put all things right.